The air was sharp with winter's bite, seeping through the thin walls of the Montana rescue shelter. Outside, the sky hung heavy with thick gray clouds, promising another night of bitter cold. Inside, the chorus of barking dogs echoed through the halls, some filled with excitement, others with desperation. Each one clamored for attention, pressing their noses against the chain-link fences, their tails wagging in hopeful anticipation. But in the farthest corner of the shelter, where the light barely reached, lay one dog who did not move. Luke, once a formidable Belgian Malinois, was now just a frail shadow of the soldier he used to be. At 18 years old, he had long outlived the prime of his breed. His once sleek coat was now patchy and dull, the golden-brown hues overtaken by strands of gray. His muscles, once strong enough to bring down enemies and leap over obstacles with precision, had withered to bones barely covered by thin skin. His ears, which had once stood tall at attention, now drooped slightly, weighed down by time and exhaustion. But the worst of it, the thing that made even the most hardened shelter workers pause, was his eyes. They were cloudy with age, dull and unfocused. Not blind, but empty. Luke did not bark. He did not whimper. He did not pace his cage like the other restless dogs. He simply lay there, motionless, his head resting against the cold, concrete floor. If not for the slow rise and fall of his chest, one might have thought he had already given up entirely. Greg, the shelter's owner, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression grim as he watched the aging Malinois. "It's been 6 months," he murmured. 6 months, and he still barely eats. The vet says there's nothing physically wrong with him. He just doesn't care anymore. Emma, a young volunteer, knelt beside Luke's cage, carefully refilling the untouched water bowl. She sighed, brushing a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Poor guy," she whispered, glancing at Greg. "He doesn't even lift his head when people walk by. It's like he's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Greg asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma hesitated, her eyes lingering on the old dog. "Maybe for someone who isn't coming back." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Luke had been more than just a dog. He had been a soldier, a protector, a hero. He had spent nearly 2 decades in service, standing beside the men and women who wore the uniform, risking his life to protect them. He had been trained to sniff out explosives, track down the lost, and stand unwavering in the face of danger. And now, after everything, after years of loyalty, after giving every ounce of himself, he had been left behind. Most dogs at the shelter were here because they had never known a home. Luke was here because his home had decided he was no longer worth keeping. Greg exhaled sharply, running a hand over his tired face. "We've had old dogs before, but none like him. It's like he's already gone, just waiting for his body to catch up." Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to believe there was hope for Luke, but deep down, she was beginning to wonder. "Has anyone even looked at him? Anyone at all?" Greg shook his head. "No one wants a dog they're just going to lose in a few months. People come in looking for a companion, not a goodbye." Emma's chest ached. She knew Greg wasn't wrong. Potential adopters always walked past Luke's cage without a second glance. Their eyes would skim over him, pausing just long enough to register his frail form before moving on to younger, livelier dogs. Puppies that would live for years. Dogs that had energy and bright, eager eyes, not an old soldier with nothing left to give. She pressed her lips together, looking at Luke's still form. "I hate this," she admitted softly. "He deserves better." Greg didn't disagree. But what could they do? No one wanted him, and Luke himself seemed to have given up. As if sensing their stares, the old Malinois shifted slightly, his body stiff from months of inactivity. His ears flicked at the sound of their voices, but he still did not lift his head. For a moment, Emma thought she saw something in him, a flicker, a ghost of the dog he had once been. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. She sighed, rising to her feet. "Maybe someone will come," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Greg didn't answer, because in his heart, he wasn't sure if Luke had that kind of time left. And worse, he wasn't sure if Luke even wanted to be saved. The Montana Rescue Shelter had not changed in the years since Sarah Carter had last stepped through its doors. The same linoleum floors stretched beneath her boots, worn from years of pause and hurried footsteps. The same metal kennels lined the walls, filled with eager dogs pressing against the fences, their tails wagging, eyes filled with hope. But Sarah had changed. 3 years had passed since she had last been here, standing in this very lobby with her husband, Eric. Back then, they had come every few weekends, volunteering to walk the abandoned dogs, sometimes bringing treats, sometimes just their time. It had been something simple, something grounding, a way for Eric to escape, if only for a little while, from the weight of his duties as a special operations soldier. Then, one day, he never came home. A mission gone wrong. A knock on the door. The neatly folded flag handed to her trembling hands. After that, Sarah had stopped coming to the shelter. She had stopped doing a lot of things. Now, as she stepped inside, the cold air that had settled into her bones over the past few years did not lift. If anything, it only grew heavier, pressing down on her as if this place carried the ghosts of everything she had lost. She wasn't here for a reason she could name. She hadn't woken up that morning planning to adopt a dog. She hadn't planned to be anywhere at all. But something had pulled her here. Something quiet and persistent, like an old memory whispering at the edges of her mind. "Sarah?" Greg's voice was warm with familiarity, though it carried a note of surprise. He stepped out from behind the front desk, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Haven't seen you in a long time." Sarah forced a small smile. "Yeah, it's been a while." Greg studied her for a beat, then simply nodded, as if he understood. He didn't press, didn't ask why she had disappeared. He had worked at the shelter long enough to know that everyone who walked through those doors carried their own burdens, their own reasons for being here, or for staying away. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "we've got plenty of dogs looking for a home. Let me know if one catches your eye." Sarah nodded absently, already turning toward the kennels. She moved slowly down the rows, her fingers grazing the metal fencing as she passed. The dogs inside responded with enthusiasm, some barking, some jumping, some whining softly for attention. They were all different sizes, different breeds, but they had one thing in common. They all wanted someone to love them. But Sarah wasn't here for them. She didn't know it yet, but she was here for him. She saw him before she truly registered what she was looking at. In the farthest corner of the shelter, where the light barely reached, a dog lay motionless. At first she thought he was asleep, but as she stepped closer, she realized that he wasn't sleeping. He simply wasn't moving. His body was curled tightly, his head resting on the cold concrete. His fur, once thick and strong, was patchy and dull, stretched over a frame that had once carried strength, but was now nothing but brittle bones. He did not react to her presence. Sarah stopped in front of his kennel, her breath catching slightly. Something about him felt different. "Who is this?" she asked. Greg hesitated. Then with a sigh, he stepped up beside her. "That's Luke," he said quietly. "He's been here for 6 months." Sarah's brows pulled together. 6 months? That's a long time." Greg nodded. "No one wants an old dog." Sarah looked back at Luke. He didn't lift his head, didn't even flick his ears in acknowledgement of their voices. It was as if he had already detached himself from the world. She crouched down beside the kennel, her voice soft. "Luke?" Nothing. She tried again. "Hey, buddy." Still, there was no response. She reached a hand toward the metal bars, not touching them, just hovering near where he lay. A breath passed, then another. Luke did not flinch, did not react at all. It was like he wasn't even there. "He was a military dog," Greg said, his voice low. "A working K9. Spent nearly 2 decades in service." Sarah's breath hitched slightly. A military dog. Her gaze flickered over Luke's body again, this time seeing him through a different lens. A soldier, a warrior, left behind. She swallowed hard, her fingers curling slightly around the bars. "What happened?" Greg exhaled slowly. His handler surrendered him, said he was too old. They didn't want to watch him decline. His tone held a quiet anger. 19 years of loyalty, and they just walked away. Sarah felt something inside her twist. 19 years. That was longer than some people served in the military, longer than some soldiers survived, longer than Eric had lived past his last deployment. Her chest ached. Greg crossed his arms. He doesn't eat much. Barely reacts to anyone. It's like he's waiting for something. Or someone. Sarah didn't realize she was holding her breath until she exhaled slowly. Waiting. She knew what that felt like. Waiting for the grief to lessen. Waiting for the ache in her chest to fade. Waiting for someone who was never coming back. She turned back to Luke. "Has anyone tried?" she asked quietly. Greg hesitated. "People look at him. But when they see how old he is, how sick he looks, they move on. No one wants to bring home a dog just to lose him." Sarah's jaw tightened. Luke had been trained to protect, to fight, to serve, and when he couldn't anymore, they left him here, waiting to die. Her hand, still hovering just above the cold metal bars, inched forward slightly. "Luke," she whispered again. For the first time, he stirred. Just slightly. A flick of an ear. The barest movement of his rib cage as he exhaled. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, his eyes opened. Sarah sucked in a breath. Their eyes met. A fleeting moment. A single heartbeat. And in that brief second, Sarah saw something she hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Not of her, but of something deeper. Pain. Loss. A shared grief. And then, just as quickly, the light in his cloudy eyes faded, and he turned his head away again. Sarah's throat tightened. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't walking away. Greg's eyes were heavy with doubt as he studied Sarah. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the weight of responsibility pressing down on both of them. "Sarah, you need to understand," he said, his voice low, measured. "He's not just old, he's given up. I don't know if he has another fight left in him. You take him home tonight, and he might not make it till morning." Sarah's jaw tightened, her hands curled into fists at her sides. "I don't care," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I will not let him die here, not alone." Greg exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He had seen people make impulsive decisions before, bringing home animals they weren't ready for. But Sarah, she wasn't impulsive. She wasn't naive. She knew what she was taking on. After a long pause, he gave a reluctant nod. "All right," he murmured. "I'll get the paperwork." Emma, standing nearby, looked between them, her expression filled with uncertainty and a sliver of hope. "You're really doing this?" she asked. Sarah glanced down at Luke, who hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged the world around him. "Yes," she whispered. She signed the necessary forms, listening as Greg went over medical instructions and dietary needs, none of which seemed to matter if Luke refused to eat. When everything was finalized, Greg handed her the leash. It felt too light in her hands, barely carrying the weight of the dog who was now hers. She crouched down beside him, brushing a gentle hand over his thin fur. "Come on, buddy," she murmured. Luke did not resist as she guided him out of the kennel, but neither did he seem to care. He moved mechanically, his steps slow and uncertain, as if walking was merely a habit rather than an instinct. Emma held the door open as Sarah led Luke outside. The air was bitterly cold, snow swirling in the Montana wind. Luke didn't react to the sharp chill, didn't sniff the crisp air like most dogs would. He just stood there, waiting. Waiting for what? Sarah swallowed past the lump in her throat and helped him into the passenger seat of her truck. He curled up immediately, his ribs rising and falling in slow, even breaths. The drive home was silent. Sarah kept glancing at him, expecting him to stir at the bumps in the road or shift when she turned, but he remained still. Not asleep, just absent. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. Had she made the right decision? Her house felt emptier than usual when she carried Luke inside. The space was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater battling against the cold outside. Sarah knelt beside the fireplace, gently easing Luke onto the large, cushioned dog bed she had set up for him. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow against his dull coat. He did not move. She sighed, brushing a hand down his frail body before getting up to prepare some food. She filled a bowl with warm, broth-soaked kibble, setting it carefully in front of him. The scent filled the room, but Luke didn't even glance at it. "Come on, boy," she coaxed softly. "Just a little." Nothing. He didn't sniff it, didn't acknowledge it. Sarah sat down on the floor beside him, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them as she studied him. "I know what this feels like," she murmured. "Giving up, letting yourself fade." Luke's breathing was slow, steady, unaffected by her words. Her fingers traced the edge of the food bowl absent-mindedly. "Eric did the same thing when he came back from deployment," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not physically, but inside. He started to slip away from me long before he was actually gone." A silence stretched between them, thick and weighted. Sarah reached out again, gently placing a hand against Luke's fur. "I don't know if you can hear me," she whispered, "but I'm not giving up on you." Luke remained still. The night stretched on, the fire casting flickering shadows along the walls. Sarah remained beside him for a long time, but eventually sleep pulled at her, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. She didn't know how much time had passed when something pulled her from sleep. A sound. A deep, uneven breath, like the world's quietest whimper. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering. She sat up quickly, her gaze sweeping the dimly lit room. Luke was gone. Her stomach clenched. She pushed herself up, scanning the house, her pulse thudding in her ears. Then she saw him. Luke stood in the hallway, his frail body silhouetted in the moonlight streaming through the window. His legs were stiff, trembling slightly from the effort of holding himself upright. But it wasn't his posture that made Sarah's breath catch. It was where he was looking. His cloudy, lifeless eyes were locked on a picture hanging on the wall, a framed photo of Eric. Sarah's chest tightened. Luke didn't move, didn't blink. His breathing was heavy, uneven, almost strained. And then a sound broke from him, low, ragged, a quiet, broken whimper. Sarah felt her pulse stutter. Since the moment she had met him, Luke had not reacted to anything. Not to voices, not to touch, not to food. But now he was staring at her husband's picture like he knew something she didn't, like he remembered something long buried. Sarah swallowed hard, stepping toward him slowly. "Luke," she whispered. His ears twitched, but he did not turn toward her. His focus remained locked on the photo. Sarah hesitated before kneeling beside him, her gaze flickering between the old Malinois and the picture of the man she had lost. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater, her mind spinning with 100 questions she couldn't yet form. Had he seen someone like Eric before? Had he served beside a man like him? Or was this something else? Something deeper? Luke let out another soft breath, his body swaying slightly from fatigue. Sarah reached out instinctively, steadying him with gentle hands. His weight was fragile under her touch, his body worn and tired. She swallowed past the sudden lump in her throat. "Come on, buddy," she murmured. "Let's get you back to bed." For a moment, she wasn't sure if he would move. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since she had brought him home, there was something there. Not just emptiness, not just resignation. Something else. Something like recognition. Sarah exhaled, steadying herself as she guided him back toward the warmth of the fireplace. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. She was going to find out. Luke had been with her for nearly a week now, and though there were small signs of change, subtle, barely perceptible signs, he was still a mystery. He followed her from room to room, but never too close. He ate, but only just enough to survive. And every night, just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she would hear it, that low, almost mournful sigh from where he lay by the fireplace, as if he carried the weight of something he could never let go. Sarah had worked with soldiers long enough to recognize that sound. It was the sound of a ghost still fighting a war long after it had ended. She needed to know who he had been before he became this hollow version of himself. Greg had given her the adoption paperwork, which included the details of Luke's former owner. She had skimmed it before, but now she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the name printed on the form. David Walker. The address was listed in a town just a few hours away. A quick search told her what she needed to know. Walker was a retired military officer, a former handler in the K-9 unit. A man who had once served beside Luke, and yet he had left him behind. Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. She had to know why. The drive was quiet, the winter roads stretching endlessly beneath the soft gray sky. Luke lay curled in the passenger seat, unmoving as always, but Sarah could feel the tension in his body. She glanced at him. "We're going to get some answers, buddy." He didn't react, but she liked to believe he was listening. The house was modest, a single-story home with a porch that looked like it hadn't seen much use in a while. She parked in the driveway, hesitating for just a moment before stepping out. Luke stirred as soon as she opened the door. His ears twitched, his body tensed. Sarah frowned. "Do you know this place?" For the first time since she had brought him home, Luke moved on his own, just a few inches, but enough for her to notice. His breathing quickened. He remembered. Sarah's stomach twisted as she walked to the front door and knocked. A long pause. Then, footsteps. The man who answered the door was older than she expected, though his posture was still rigid, his presence still carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years giving orders. His eyes, sharp but weary, flickered between her and the dog standing beside her. Then, something in his face changed. "Luke," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Luke's body tensed further, his paws shifting uneasily against the porch. Sarah crossed her arms. "You recognize him?" David Walker exhaled slowly, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in." She hesitated, glancing down at Luke. He wasn't trembling, but she could feel the unease radiating from him. Still, she stepped forward. Inside, the house was sparsely decorated, clean but impersonal. Framed medals lined the walls, certificates of service, photos of a younger Walker in uniform. And in the corner of the living room, almost hidden, was a picture of Luke. A younger Luke. His fur was thick, his eyes bright, standing beside a man in full combat gear. Sarah swallowed. "You served together?" she said, more of a statement than a question. Walker nodded. For a long time. She turned to face him. Then tell me why you left him. Walker's expression tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out as if he were looking at something far beyond the snow-covered yard. I couldn't do it, he said finally. His voice was low, almost hollow. Sarah frowned. Do what? He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. Watch him die. The words hung between them like a heavy weight. Sarah clenched her jaw. So instead, you left him in a shelter to die alone? Walker's eyes darkened. You don't understand. No, she snapped, taking a step closer. I don't understand. Because I've worked with men like you. I've seen the way handlers and their dogs trust each other. You weren't just his owner. You were his partner. His whole life was about serving you, protecting you, and when he needed you the most, you walked away. Walker flinched. For the first time, Sarah saw something behind his hardened exterior. Regret, guilt. I have lost too many, he said, his voice breaking just slightly. Too many partners, too many brothers, and then I started losing him too. He wasn't the same anymore. He was slowing down, getting confused. He wasn't Luke anymore. Sarah's breath hitched. Wasn't that the same thing she had felt when Eric came back from deployment? The same helplessness as she watched someone she loved fade in front of her? But she had stayed. Walker hadn't. And what about him? She asked, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. Did you ever think about what it felt like for him? He spent his whole life by your side. Then, one day, you weren't there anymore. Walker looked away. Sarah swallowed, pushing back the sting in her eyes. You owed him more than that. Walker's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly, looking at Luke, really looking at him this time. I know, he admitted. I was wrong. The room fell into silence. Sarah let out a slow breath, then knelt beside Luke, running a hand over his fur. We're leaving, she murmured. Walker hesitated. Can I? Sarah hesitated too. She looked at Luke. For a long moment he just stood there, staring at the man who had once been his whole world. Then without warning he turned away. Walker's breath caught. Sarah exhaled. You made your choice, she said. Now I'm making mine. And with that, she and Luke walked out the door. The morning was colder than usual. A thick layer of frost coated the windows, and the world outside was still, as if holding its breath. Inside, the fireplace had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow across the living room. Sarah stirred beneath the blanket draped over her on the couch, stretching slightly before her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Then she heard it, a sound so faint, so fragile, that at first she thought she had imagined it, a low, labored breath. Her heart clenched. She turned sharply, her eyes searching for Luke's familiar form by the fireplace. But he wasn't curled in his usual spot. Instead, he lay sprawled on the bed she had set up for him, his body unnaturally still except for the slight tremors rippling through him. Luke? She was on her feet before she realized she had even moved, her pulse hammering in her ears. Luke didn't lift his head. His breathing was shallow, uneven, each exhale more strained than the last. His body trembled, though the house was warm. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his frail form, not knowing where to touch, how to help. Hey, buddy, she whispered, her voice breaking. Stay with me, okay? His only response was another weak exhale. Panic surged through her, sharp and unforgiving. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the vet's number. Please, she murmured under her breath as it rang. The moment the line clicked, she didn't wait for pleasantries. It's Luke, she said quickly, her voice strained. He's not breathing right. He's shaking and... Bring him in. Now, the vet instructed without hesitation. Sarah didn't waste another second. She grabbed a blanket and carefully wrapped it around Luke's frail body, before lifting him into her arms. He barely reacted, his head resting limply against her shoulder. She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to move fast but steady as she carried him out into the freezing morning air. The drive to the vet was a blur. Sarah barely noticed the road, barely registered the passing houses or the way her breath came short and uneven. She kept glancing at Luke in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Stay with me," she whispered, as if sheer willpower could keep him from slipping away. By the time she reached the clinic, the vet techs were already waiting. They rushed forward the moment she opened the door, gently taking Luke from her arms. His body looked impossibly small beneath the bright clinic lights, his fur barely rising with each shallow breath. Dr. Whitaker, the head vet, met her gaze, his expression grim. "Come with me," he said, leading her into an exam room. Sarah stood back, her hands clenched into fists as they worked quickly, checking his vitals, listening to his heart, feeling for signs of pain. The minutes stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last. Finally, Dr. Whitaker straightened, his expression unreadable. "He's stable for now," he said. Sarah let out a shaky breath, relief and fear warring within her. "But," she prompted, already knowing there was more. Dr. Whitaker sighed. "Sarah, he's old. His body is failing. What happened today, this isn't the last time. And eventually it's going to get worse." She swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" The vet hesitated, then met her eyes. "I need to ask if you want to let him go." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Sarah blinked, her mind rejecting them even as they settled deep into her bones. Let him go. She stared at Luke, lying still on the exam table, his breaths slow but present. He had fought his whole life, for others, for survival, for duty. And now, after everything, he was being asked to surrender. Her throat tightened. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure if she ever would be. But then she looked closer. Luke's body was frail, but there was something else in him. Something that had been missing since the day she met him. He was still here, still fighting. And if he wasn't giving up, neither was she. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting Dr. Whitaker's gaze. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the tears burning in her eyes. "If he hasn't given up, then I won't either." Dr. Whitaker studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Then let's fight for him." Sarah reached out, brushing her fingers gently over Luke's fur. She had made her choice, and she wasn't turning back. The days blurred together into a quiet, careful rhythm. Every morning, Sarah woke before the sun, padding softly into the living room where Luke lay curled by the fireplace. Every morning, she braced herself for the worst, that she would find him still, his body having given up in the night. But every morning, his chest still rose and fell, his breaths weak but present. And so, the fight continued. She fed him by hand, coaxing him into eating small portions of warm, softened food. At first, he barely opened his mouth, his cloudy eyes staring past her as if she wasn't there. She didn't push, didn't rush him. She sat beside him, whispering quiet words, her voice steady and patient, until finally, hesitantly, he licked the food from her palm. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. Every day she helped him stand, supporting his frail frame as he took trembling steps across the living room floor. His legs were weak, his muscles long atrophied from disuse, but Sarah didn't let him fall. When he staggered, she steadied him. When he collapsed from exhaustion, she sat beside him, running her fingers through his thinning fur. "You don't have to do this alone," she murmured one night, her hand resting against his side as he slept. "Not anymore." Luke didn't respond, not in words, not in movement. But Sarah liked to think that, somewhere deep inside, he heard her. The changes were small at first. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, started to follow her when she moved. Not much, just the barest flicker of recognition when she walked past him. But it was something. Then came the first time he lifted his head when she spoke his name. Then the first time he sniffed the air when she brought him his food. Then one cold morning, Sarah walked into the living room, arms full with a fresh blanket, and stopped in her tracks. Luke was standing. Not leaning against anything, not supported by her hands, just standing. His legs trembled beneath him, his frail body swaying with the effort, but he was up. Sarah's breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Luke?" He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze for the first time in weeks. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, a sharp wave of emotion crashing over her. "You did it," she whispered, taking a hesitant step toward him. "You're standing." His legs buckled after only a few seconds, but Sarah didn't care. She dropped to her knees beside him, running her fingers over his fur, her throat tightening. "You're still in there, aren't you?" she murmured. "You're still fighting." His tail twitched. Barely a movement, but enough. Sarah let out a watery laugh, relief flooding through her. The days stretched into weeks. Luke grew stronger little by little until one afternoon he took his first steps outside. Sarah had left the front door open to let in the crisp Montana air, the winter frost beginning to soften into early spring. She turned from the kitchen, expecting to see Luke still resting by the fireplace, but instead, he was on the porch. Her breath caught. Luke stood at the threshold, his paws hesitantly pressing against the wooden floorboards. His body was still frail, his movements stiff, but he was there. He had made it outside. Sarah swallowed past the lump in her throat, stepping toward him carefully, as if afraid that if she moved too fast, the moment would shatter. "You made it," she whispered. Luke didn't turn to look at her. Not yet. His nose twitched, sniffing the cool breeze. The wind ruffled his thinning fur, and for the first time, he seemed to take in the world around him. Sarah sat down beside him on the porch, watching him. "You're not a lost soldier," she said softly, her fingers brushing against his fur. "You're not a forgotten war dog. You're Luke." She hesitated, then added, her voice barely above a whisper, "And you have a home." For a long moment, Luke remained still. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward her. His cloudy eyes held something they hadn't in months. Something warm. Something real. And then, without warning, he pressed his head against her hand. Sarah's breath caught. She froze, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile trust he had just given her. Then, slowly, she curled her fingers around his fur, anchoring herself in the moment. Luke let out a low, contented sigh, settling beside her. The weight in Sarah's chest lifted, just slightly. Because for the first time since she had brought him home, she didn't feel like she was waiting for him to fade. She felt like she was watching him live. The Montana sky stretched wide and endless above Sarah's small home, painted in soft hues of gold and lavender as the sun dipped toward the horizon. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the crisp scent of pine and the lingering bite of winter's retreat. The world was shifting, changing, much like the old dog resting on the worn wooden porch beside her. Luke was no longer the frail, forgotten soldier she had carried out of that shelter weeks ago. His body was still aged, his movements still slow, but there was something in him now that hadn't been there before. A quiet strength, a presence, a will to live. Sarah glanced down at him, watching the way his ears twitched as he listened to the distant sounds of the world, the chirp of birds settling into their nests, the whisper of wind through the grass. His once dull eyes, though still cloudy with age, held a spark that had been missing for too long. She reached over, running her fingers gently through his fur. He leaned into her touch, exhaling a slow, contented breath. "You know," she murmured, "I used to think I was saving you." Luke didn't move, but she knew he was listening. "But the truth is," she continued, her voice softer now, "you saved me too." For so long, Sarah had been drifting, stuck in the limbo between grief and survival. She had lost herself in the emptiness left behind after Eric's death, convincing herself that solitude was easier, that letting people or animals get close would only lead to more pain. But Luke had changed that. He had given her a reason to wake up in the morning, a purpose beyond just existing. In nursing him back to health, she had found a part of herself she thought was gone forever. She smiled, watching as Luke closed his eyes, his head resting on his paws. The wind played gently through his fur, and for the first time, he looked completely at peace. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The cold of winter melted into the fresh bloom of spring, and Luke continued to defy the odds. He would never be young again, would never regain the strength he once had as a military K-9, but he had found something far more important: a home. Mornings were spent in quiet companionship. Sarah would drink her coffee on the porch, while Luke lay stretched out beside her, soaking in the warmth of the rising sun. He would follow her as she moved through the house, his footsteps slow but steady, always keeping her within sight. Afternoons were filled with small joys. Luke would wander the yard, sniffing the air, taking in the scents carried by the wind. He no longer hesitated at the threshold of the door, no longer lingered in the corners of the house like a ghost. He belonged here, and he knew it. And in the evenings, as the sky darkened and the world grew still, Sarah would sit beside him, her fingers tracing gentle patterns through his fur, whispering stories of the past, of Eric, of their days at the shelter, of the life she had before, and the life they were building now. Through it all, Luke remained her steady companion. He was no longer just a dog left behind by his former handler, no longer just a soldier who had been discarded when he was no longer useful. He was Luke, and he was family. One evening, as Sarah sat beside the fireplace, flipping through an old photo album, she felt Luke's head nudge against her arm. She looked down, surprised, and saw him staring at the picture in her lap, the one of Eric, smiling in his uniform, his arm wrapped around a younger, stronger version of herself. Sarah swallowed past the lump in her throat. She reached out, brushing her fingers against the worn edges of the photo. "You would have liked him," she murmured. Luke let out a soft breath, pressing his head against her leg. Maybe, in some way, he already did. The days passed too quickly, slipping through her fingers like sand. She knew their time was limited. Luke was old, and no amount of love or care could change that. But she no longer feared the inevitable. Because now, when that day came, Luke wouldn't be alone, and neither would she. One late afternoon, as the golden light stretched across the porch, Sarah sat beside Luke, watching as the wind stirred the trees. He was breathing steadily, his body warm against her side. She leaned down, pressing her forehead lightly against his. "You're home," she whispered. "You've always been home." Luke let out a soft sigh, his tail flicking against the wooden floor in quiet agreement. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt whole. Because love, true, unwavering love, wasn't about how much time you had left. It was about what you did with the time you were given. And Luke had been given a second chance. So had she. Neither of them would waste it. This heartwarming story is more than just one of the many dog stories we hear. It's a testament to loyalty, resilience, and the power of second chances. It reminds us that no life, no matter how old or forgotten, is beyond love and redemption. This German shepherd, once abandoned, found his way back not just to a home, but to a heart that refused to give up on him. It's a powerful lesson that true loyalty deserves to be returned, that kindness can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes saving a dog means saving a part of ourselves. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.